tuning in with KrASIA, bringing human stories to life.
Welcome to Oasis by KrASIA. My name is Taro and I'll be your host for this episode. Today I get to speak with Roger Shakes, who has over 25 years of experience in TV, media, advertising and technology. He has produced and presented TV programs for the BBC, Channel 4 and Maori TV in New Zealand. Also delivered advertising campaigns for global giants. Roger is an active member of the startup and accelerator community in New Zealand, where he's also an investor, business consultant and is a mentor to a number of CEOs. Alright, so Roger, you've had a pretty long career across tech, advertising, media, and I'm sure you've witnessed these industries go through a lot of changes, especially with the digital era coming in. Looking back to when you first started working in these industries, what do you think have been some of the biggest changes with the biggest impacts?
Well, I think for me, Taro, one of the big changes in my lifetime, which is kind of showing my age, is the introduction of the internet. So if you can imagine doing advertising and broadcast media in the days before the internet, you would be sending things via telex or fax. The whole process of how you communicate over distances was completely different. Time delays, even the way in which you would plan a project would be completely different, because you'd have to build in, for example, post time. You know, it takes time for me to send my video to another country via DHL and wait 2 days for the response. So the introduction of the internet was probably the most dramatic and most impactful change I've seen in my career. And I think since the introduction of that kind of tech, it's opened up whole new industries which have emerged from that as a result of the availability of easy communications and digital transformation.
It is an interesting point that you bring up, because I think, especially in my age range, there was probably an element of that too, where we lived in a period of no real internet. I think you probably extended a bit more because you were working without the internet.
Yeah.
Having a call like this must have been insane to think about it.
Well, again, if I go back to my early career, I can remember back in, in the 80s, having to get on a plane to drop off, as it were then, big U-matic discs to a client. And you would essentially fly, because it was cheaper and quicker for me to fly with the content than it would be to post it. You just wouldn't ask someone to do that now. You just send it down the line. So it's significant changes, but I think some of them have been for the better. And I think even now with COVID, and we're living in that kind of almost that post-pandemic world, I think some of those technological advances have been accelerated even further. So I think you'll see within the broader marketplace, decision makers, CEOs, making more decisions that will be delivered quicker because they've had to do it during COVID and they've seen the benefit of it, and they're adapting to a new way of working. I think some things will never be the same again.
I'm glad you bring up COVID, because obviously it's been a pretty big factor this year, and New Zealand's done really well. I think the way they've managed to keep the country going without any major effects has been really impressive. However, it is geographically isolated. Has that been a factor in terms of business or just general day-to-day living for you or your peers?
Yeah, so, MediaTek Partners operates globally. And so we have a lot of relationships across Europe, Southeast Asia, North America, Africa, and obviously Australia and our neighbours. And we would spend a lot of time doing face-to-face contact and then supporting that with Zoom calls. I remember Zoom before Zoom was a thing. And we would regularly connect with people in different time zones. And I think what COVID has done is it separated a little bit of that intimacy, but it's still been able to have what I would call transactional activity, because technology has enabled us, particularly in relationships that already exist, to continue doing business. So I think COVID, on the one hand, has just solidified some of those relationships. But on the other hand, you've not been able to make new ones in the way that you would do normally, attending a conference or being in a different environment where people have come together. And some of those, what I would call, evening late night drinks around an event can't happen. And they're just not the same through technology. So people will still want that face-to-face contact. And I think as soon as people are able to travel, I think you'll see business people get on planes and get back into that environment as well.
You mentioned the internet before.
And even with the internet and being able to connect with people cross-border, especially now with the extra connectivity, has it helped with doing business, or is that human factor still that sort of number one clincher for a lot of things?
Well, people like doing business with people they know. And to get to know someone, you need to meet them. And I think all COVID has done is slowed down some of that activity. Where the relationship already exists, I think people have been able to transact. And I think COVID and the internet has helped to drive a lot more people's awareness of what's possible. And so you're getting more people who haven't done things like that actually engaging in things like Zoom and Google Meets or whatever it happens to be. But more importantly, they still know that they need to have these group discussions and, finding a format to do that will now include using technology more frequently. Ultimately, I think people still want to meet face to face.
Yeah. So with Media Tech Partners, you're obviously doing a lot more work in the media industry. What have been some of the challenges this year? I'm sure there's probably quite a lot around production and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So New Zealand's been really fortunate in that, some production has been able to continue. Obviously, we've got a closed border, so there's a restriction on who can come into the country to work. But nevertheless, people are finding creative ways to get projects off the ground. And as we move into our summer period, there's lots of production activity taking place because we've got COVID managed in a way that allows us to still go out and meet in groups and do things that other people can't do in other parts of the world. That said, from a Media Tech Partners point of view, what we're really looking to do is to continue enhancing the credibility, if you like, that New Zealand has built in terms of innovation, IP development, creative content, and share that in the external market so that we can take what we do here into a wider environment and develop that commercially and see the growth that will come later in the months and years ahead. I don't think we'll see it immediately, but I think the work that's been done and the groundwork that we've done and other companies have done in terms of developing IP that can travel, New Zealand is now seen as a place that understands how to do things and do it well. And I think that will translate not just from a COVID environment, but also into a business and commercial environment.
So you've had a pretty interesting career. Like I said at the start, you've done a lot of media advertising and now with Media Tech a bit of investing as well. But you've also worked in the startups.
Yeah.
Now there's been quite a lot of success stories that have been pushed out by the media, and they grab a lot of good headlines. But there's also the other side where a lot of startups fail. From your experience, what are some of the common themes that you see as to why startups fail?
Yeah, again, I think failure is a negative word. I'm never keen on using the word failure. Yeah. I see those challenges as being things that happen to people and organisations because sometimes you don't have the right team that enables you to take things forward. Sometimes your offering isn't quite fit for purpose. And sometimes it's a case of investors wanting a quick return when actually it's a long play. And so there's always a number of factors that determine why a startup moves forward or falls over. That said, when a startup does fall over, I think what you find is that the people that work in that environment are all energized to go and do something again because they understand the pathway that can lead to success. And that element of risk-taking is not necessarily in your DNA. When you work in a company and then you move into a startup, you learn to understand how risks can benefit a company and organisation, and you take that with you into your next role. So therefore, you're a little bit more bold, you probably have more of an entrepreneurial attitude, you understand the path to market, which means that your confidence is greater the second time, third time round. And I think people forget that the lessons you learn going through those types of environments are invaluable because no one teaches you how to fail. And failure is not necessarily something that you look for or you seek, but you can definitely learn from. I mean, I'm always reminded of Winston Churchill, for example, who had massive failures early on in his career in the First World War in particular. If you go and search his history, there are incredible failures that he had to go through and endure. But that made him well placed in the Second World War to actually understand the threat and how to deal with that threat and actually come through that period in his life as a hero, as a successful person. And this is exactly the same with a startup. You're young, you're full of energy, you do things that you probably won't do when you're 50. But when you go through that process It allows you to understand the perspective in a whole different way, and therefore you're able to manage success as you then encounter new opportunities.
In saying that, there's now quite a lot of data and quite a lot of insights and quite a lot of experiences of startups failing and that sort of thing. But despite that, there still are a lot of founders or even investors, big name investors, that continue to make quite bad decisions. I think there's been a couple of very, very big name startups that have fallen under this. Why do you think this still happens? Why do you think the same mistakes keep getting made over and over again?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons, and there isn't one methodology that determines why a company is going to be successful. And in the same way, there isn't one thing that kind of ensures a company is not going to be successful. It's a little bit like life. When you're living your life and you perhaps are looking for love, for example, there's plenty of opportunities out there, but you might land on one relationship, but it doesn't work out. But millions of people continue to search for new relationships. And in the business world, what we're all looking for is to be on a journey with a company or an idea or a person that we believe has something different to offer. And we invest our time, energy, money in that proposition, and we do our best to support them. But it doesn't always work out, just like relationships. They don't always work out. When it does, it's great, everybody cites them. But no one wants to cite a relationship that fails. And, we all have those experiences. And in business, it's no different. And I think what you will continue to see is when you have, for example, low interest rates, people are looking to invest their money into things that will give them a different return. And so they look at startups as being something that they're prepared to perhaps take a risk on because the returns are going to be so exponential that they're prepared to have a look. And in that case, it's like placing a bet on a horse. You don't know which one's going to win, but you want to be in the race. So you'll see a lot of investors spread their risk across a number of startups in the hope that 1 in 100 might make it, but will make up for the losses in the other 99. So I think people will continue to do it because when things are moving so quickly and change is happening so quickly, you don't know what business is going to be the next big thing. Because even if you look retrospectively, you can't say why Facebook, for example, outdid MySpace. MySpace was first into the market, or Bebo, or whatever it happens to be. Facebook wasn't that different, but it's timing, it's the right place, it's the people, etc., etc. And so they're all looking at the marketplace in a similar lens, and they're prepared to back a few horses because they like the energy that environment gives them and the potential return on that investment. And if it falls over, they'll continue to look for another horse.
That is very true. So, like you said, failure is a bit of a bad word in the sense that there's a lot of negative connotations to it. But I think you could argue that also failure is at times over-glamourized.
Yeah.
People say you have to fail, and people sort of just fail continuously because of that sort of narrative. What do you think is the perfect balance in that regards?
Well, I think a lot is determined by the culture that you're operating in. So, for example, if you're in Silicon Valley and, you've been through 2 or 3, 4 startups and they haven't managed to materialize any gain, it's not seen as a negative. But if you're in New Zealand where the market is smaller and you go through that same cycle, that's seen as quite a difficult badge of honour to wear. So culturally, I think there are things that help determine people's resilience and the nature of their resilience. I think in New Zealand, we're beginning to understand a little bit more that failure sometimes helps that individual grow and helps them with their next proposition to do it better and more refined. Whereas I think in the past, it might have been seen as don't touch that person, they have failed. So culture helps us understand that a lot more. I think also just the word resilience, individuals can be really resilient. And if they're dogmatic and, have a strong personality, they can drive through where other people will give up. And I think the ability to be resilient in business, whether it's a startup or a high growth or established company, is a fact of life now because the world is changing around us. Therefore, we have to be resilient in order to adapt to the new environments that we face.
So for you, what's a sort of failure experience that you've had personally that you learnt from and grew from?
Well, I think startup is really interesting. When you get involved in startups, either as an investor or getting involved in an actual entity, I think you go on a journey that's new for you because it's new for everybody. And I think one of the things that I personally find is that when you try to bring a team together to do something innovative in a new way, in a new environment that's challenging, everybody brings a different level of energy that you don't get in a regular job. And that energy is quite addictive, to be quite honest, because you have a level of passion for the work that you do that means that the hours that you do them don't really impact on you. They impact on your family perhaps, but you're happy to do it. And I think the drive that you need to be successful comes from that energy, comes from that same place. And I think people who become slightly addicted to that energy of wanting to take something that doesn't exist into something that does exist, into something that then grows and have a life of its own, is part of my thing that I think, so one falls over, you get on another horse and you run again. But ultimately what you're trying to do is to be successful with everything that you touch in every part of your life. And the energy you bring to that is what draws people to you, which then encourages you to keep going.
So we've touched on failure a fair bit. I think it would be quite good to also hear what have been some of your highlights for you personally in the last 20, 30 years?
Well, I think one of the things I would say to any young person wanting to enter the entrepreneurial world is that it is a world. You are going to encounter different cultures, different languages, different types of people, and it will feed your education and your business acumen in a way that you wouldn't get by just studying. And I think it's a little bit of a cliche, but lifelong learning is part of our life now. And so if you're open to learning new things in new ways, that in itself is successful. And I would encourage any young person that has an idea or has a passion to go out and carve their path for themselves, because that journey in itself is really exciting and dynamic. And the highlight for me is just, coming from the East End of London and being able to travel the globe, earn some money, live in a fantastic place called New Zealand. That journey is a success story. It's my success story. It's personal to me, but it's one that you want to share in small measures with other people that you come into contact with. And, just being in New Zealand at this point in history is a wonderful testimony to the journey that I've had in the past.
Fantastic. 2020 has been a bit of a crazy year. What will be your biggest takeaway?
I think in a funny kind of way, 2020 has been a year that everybody's had to stop at some point and reflect on what they've done, where they want to go, what they want to do. I think for me, particularly when I talk to people in other territories around the world, it's a realization that life is precious and that you get one innings, as it were. You need to spend your time with people and with projects that you love. Because if you can do that, then you're going to be far richer in terms of being fulfilled. And so I would, again, it's a simple thing, but people will use COVID to make step changes in their own life, both personally and professionally. And I think out of that comes a new optimism, a new kind of direction that will take the globe on a new journey, I think. Because people will see things differently. They'll prioritise things differently. And the way in which they conduct themselves will be different because of the time they've had to spend reflecting and thinking about how they want to live their life. So, I think 2020 has been one of those step change years. We will see maybe in 10, 15 years from now, the world will look different and feel different, and we might be able to trace its roots back to 2020.